Hello, and thanks for joining us today for our conversation with author and journalist Justin Davidson. My name is Dominic Ruiz, and I'm one of the co-chairs of the Municipal Art Society's Urbanist Leadership Council, alongside my counterpart, Anna Raginskaya. For over 125 years, the Municipal Art Society has been a tireless advocate, inspiring New Yorkers to engage in the betterment of our city. MAS has been instrumental in creating the Landmarks Preservation Commission, the Tribute and Light at Ground Zero, and the preservation of Grand Central Terminal, among many other achievements. Today, they are hard at work ensuring an equitable, sustainable, and economically vibrant city. Their Fight for Light campaign, which I encourage you to learn about at mas.org, is ensuring access to light amidst rapid growth and of super tall skyscrapers. The MAS Urbanists group are a group of young professionals and ambassadors of this storied organization, passionate about New York City and creating the next generation of advocates. These are people in different industries, backgrounds, and professions who really share a love for New York and want to take part of it in its evolution through dialogue, conversation, and discovery. And it's to that end that I'd like to kick it over to my fellow Urbanist Leadership Council member, Noam Freshman, to tell us what inspired him about Justin's article and why the Urbanists and MAS wanted to bring this particular conversation to the forefront. Noam?
Thanks, Dominic, and thank you all for joining us today. We're very excited for the conversation. When our fellow Urbanist member, Anna, shared Mr. Davidson's article with our group, we were all struck as lovers of density and New York City itself by how it differed from many of the articles being shared. While there are many thought pieces that were and still are kind of predicting the end of cities or even the end of skyscrapers because of COVID-19, Mr. Davidson helpfully reminded us that, to quote his article, New York has been a scary place for most of the past 400 years. Fire, flood, attack, crime, rebellion, drugs, and disease have shaped it. His article, we felt, is an important reminder that what's past is prologue, and that at every, as he says, to quote him, at every desperate juncture, New York has grown and transformed as it healed. The qualities that have always made New York prone to disaster also make it uniquely capable of regeneration. Mr. Davidson's piece is a refreshing dose of clarity and hope in these painful times for our world, our city, and our communities, especially for the most vulnerable among us. It's for this reason that we reached out to him and why we really look forward to our discussion today, and we greatly appreciate his time and perspective. To kick off the discussion, I'd just like to introduce MAS's president and our moderator today, Elizabeth Goldstein. Elizabeth has spent her career tenaciously and effectively advocating for parks, open spaces, and historic preservation here in New York and across the country. Elizabeth is a native New Yorker and grew up in Soundview in the Bronx.
Yes, we're joined by people all over New York City, across the United States, and actually in multiple places around the world. So welcome this evening. We're delighted to have you. Before I begin, I just want to share a few notes about our platform so you're using it effectively and not surprised by what might appear in front of you. On the right-hand side of your screen is a chat function. There you can comment, talk to each other, and ask questions. And I will be doing my best to integrate as many of your questions as I can into the conversation as we go, as I'm deep into a conversation with Justin Davidson in a few minutes. Throughout the day's program, you'll see some buttons that will open up on the bottom of your screen. And those buttons will provide additional information or resources that you might be interested in seeing or reserving for later. If you click on them, they'll open in a new browser window on your computer so that even after you close down the program, they'll still be available to you. Don't forget to come back to us, obviously, after they've opened. We anticipate running about an hour and look forward to recording this event as we go. So lastly, and before we dive into the conversation, I want to thank our hosts, the Urbanist Leadership Council. We're very pleased to have this extremely thoughtful idea for tonight's program. And I also want to thank my colleagues, Tara Kelly, Iana Angelo, Jackie Muellen, Britt Densmore, and Megan Barron for taking this idea and making it happen. So I would like to turn to my introduction of Justin Davidson himself. Most of us know him in our world as someone who writes extremely insightfully about New York City. However, that isn't the half of it. He has been at New York Magazine's classical music critic and architectural critic since 2007. His book, Magnetic City, A Walking Companion to New York, was published by Spiegel and Grau in April of 2017. He was the Newsday's classical music critic from 96 to 2007. And in 2002, he won a Pulitzer Prize for his classical music criticism. That year, he also added architecture to his beat and was there until he left for New York Magazine. He was also a finalist this year for his music criticism, a Pulitzer again as well. So welcome, Justin. We're delighted to have you this evening.
There I am. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Welcome.
Nice to be here.
Delighted to start by just, first of all, thanking you for this very, very beautiful piece. It's passionate. We are used to passionate writing about New York from you, but this piece that inspired this discussion tonight was unusually poignant. It was entitled The Return of Fear, New York City, A Child of Disaster Remembers Its Past. And I guess maybe we should start the discussion tonight by really asking what inspired you to write about this particular theme at this particular time. Obviously, we know we're in a pandemic, but I suspect there are deeper reasons for wanting to write about this particular theme at this particular moment.
Well, sure. I mean, it was very personal. You know, I clearly remember being in New York in 2001 on 9/11 and immediately afterwards, and that feeling that the city was really deeply wounded and that the destruction of the World Trade Center was going to have really dramatic ripple effects, of course, on the country, but specifically on the city in ways that I think kind of we forgot a little bit over time what that meant and what that felt like. There was a sense that New York had really sort of passed its peak and that maybe a lot of the things that we loved most about the city were not going to be able to recover, were really deeply under threat. And so that experience of having seen that, and then the time afterwards when, you know, a lot changed, but not the things we thought might. It wasn't the end of tall buildings. It wasn't the end of office work. It wasn't the end of Manhattan as a global capital. It wasn't the end of density. But, you know, a lot of things did change. So I just basically thought this was a good moment to think about what a really, almost an act of violence or sort of a violent impact, what that means for living in the city. And, you know, in writing, you mentioned my book, Magnetic City, which has a lot of history in it. And in the course of writing that and trying to understand as you look around the city, why it looks the way it does, why is the city the way it is, it became clear to me looking back that much of it was based on, it grew out of some of these similar traumas, and that those traumas had shaped the history of New York. So that was something that I really had in my mind, and it became a useful tool to think about, you know, looking at the city now, trying to imagine, you know, what are we going to be looking back on, say, a decade from now?
Your piece and some reading that I did in Magnetic City this weekend, just a little bit of review for me, reminded me of these incidents that you refer to in the article, where the city really comes back resurgent, just as you've described after 9/11. Many predictions of failure, that do not prove to be the case, and the city comes back resilient. I guess, this pandemic, I think, has been very powerful for many of us because it's reinforced for some, really highlighted the inequities in the city itself, and the way our fellow New Yorkers have suffered from the pandemic. And I'm wondering if you can just talk a little bit about whether any of the recoveries that you talk about in your piece or in Magnetic City have fundamentally changed any of those inequities of the inequities of their own time. Maybe sharing an example or two about those that might give us some hope for the moment.
And say, New York is resilient, and you're going to hit us, we're going to pop right back, and we're going to be fine, and it will be the way it was before. I think that's, I don't think we want to run the risk of complacency or to think about this, maybe we can talk about this later, but to think of it as sort of a great opportunity to do the things we've always wanted to do, and now that things are in flux, we can swoop in and do them. I think what past disasters of various kinds have done is created a sense of obligation, and I think that's what we have now. So to my mind, the operative word is not opportunity, but obligation. And yes, I think that to take a couple of examples that I use in the article, one was structural, about infrastructure, and some others were about disease or behavior. So in the first case, first a cholera epidemic and then a fire in 1835 crystallized a sense that had been in the city for a while, that there was an urgent need to bring clean water from a source outside Manhattan in a dependable way. And, that was an idea that had been kicking around for a long time, but it wasn't really until sort of from 1835 into the 1840s that really became urgent. And it didn't become urgent overnight. We're talking about an expensive infrastructure problem that, involved construction and corruption and politics, of just like it does in our era. But the city could not have turned into a major urban center without that source of water. And yet it wasn't the desire to turn into a major urban center that prompted it. It was the obvious need for water that could not have been clearer because of this experience, both with cholera and with fire. And that culminates with the opening of the Croton Aqueduct and the opening of the reservoir at what is now Bryant Park. And so those dramatically shaped the city, but not immediately. It takes time. And another, towards the end of the 19th century and into the beginning of the 20th, other kinds of disease clarified the need, which had been apparent for a long time, for more hygienic and livable housing. And so that really, a series of events started and reinforced a movement for housing reform, which was a movement for equity. But it took at least 50 years to get anything meaningful enacted in law. And as we know from looking around and from our experience with NYCHA, it's not a done deal. It's not a finished story. So, these conversations are never simple, but I think those are two examples of things that really did galvanize a sense of need and obligation to do something dramatic in the city.
Since you mentioned NYCHA, I just would like to ask you a little bit of a question about the fact that you excoriate Corbusier's technocratic gospel in your piece, and also you exonerate Olmsted for getting it wrong about public health. Both of them envisioned their contributions to the city really being improvements to public health. And I'm wondering whether there are lessons from their mistakes and their triumphs that in fact relate to today as well.
From Le Corbusier and Olmsted?
Also Olmsted.
Well, I think those are sort of separate strands. My feeling about Le Corbusier, he was a great architect, but it's not just what he thought and what he wrote and what he designed, but the way that legacy was interpreted through the generations and translated into policy as well as design. And you know, while in a period when there were still exhibitions that we could go to physically, there was a very interesting exhibition that I wrote about, organized by the MAS Design Group, about urban renewal in smaller cities around the country. But the same thing is true for New York, and the damage to the urban fabric and to the social fabric that some of those really grand scale interventions inflicted, and those were things that were, you can't blame Le Corbusier for them directly, but they certainly were influenced by a kind of Corbusian approach to planning. So, you know, I think the effect of that is, you know, I'm ambivalent about it. It had its good things. It also, you know, in the way it played out, did a lot of damage. But again, you know, differently in different places. New York got off relatively easy in that we actually have a populous and functioning, although barely, public housing system. With Olmsted, I think, you know, you don't have to be right 100% of the time to do some really extraordinary things. He was wrong, as most people in his period were, about the miasma theory of, you know, where disease came from. Can't blame him for, you know, being with a scientific current that turned out to, you know, be off target later on. I mean, you know, what he believed was largely what the scientific community believed. But what he learned from that, or what he took away from that in terms of both urban planning and then his work as a public health expert, was in part the need for parks as a, not just for recreation, but really as a living part of the city, as a place that people could come, get away from environments that were maybe toxic, and be in a place where everybody could share in the natural resources of the city, breathe clean air, be together in the outdoors. And, you know, what's amazing is that here we are 150 years after the creation of Central Park and Riverside Park and Prospect Park, and then, you know, all of their smaller descendants, and you know, even bigger parks like Pelham Bay Park, and they are crucial for mental health, for our ability to get outdoors at all, for whatever social interactions we have. They're crucial. They're under pressure because they're crowded in a way that they weren't before. We have just rediscovered how much we need them. And you know, how forward-looking is to create something that in a pressured emergency environment like this can function so well and serve so many different purposes, including, by the way, a field hospital of the kind that he had something to do with and supervised during the Civil War.
Whether this dialogue in a fundamental way about density and openness, that is, one imagines a conversation between Jane Jacobs and Olmsted. She was a reviler in some ways of parks because she felt like they were gentrifiers. But of course, they play both roles, right? They play the role of being the lungs of the city, as well as allowing for the density that can be built around them, because one cannot happen without the other. And as the city begins to open its streets in a different way now, I think that's an interesting example of some experimentation that's going on that may lead to some long-term examples as well. I'd love to turn, if I may, for a moment to some of your arts writing, actually, and another piece that you wrote recently about the impact that COVID will have on the arts, which I found very moving. And it was a piece where you remind us that a lot of architectural forms, whether that's opera house or theaters, have responded, are a response to changing art forms and the way in which they get displayed. And I wonder whether you could comment a little bit. You made a really lovely remark, which I'll quote, that talks about maybe art happening in unexpected places. You said, but guiding an audience safely through a landscape while performers remain still could be fruitful and sublime. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about this idea of the moving audience, and maybe more importantly, the role that non-traditional spaces, whether it's parks or streets or even indoor public spaces, might play in this moment when we may not be able to gather for a long time in a more traditional setting.
So I think this brings together a lot of different issues. One of them is how we use public space. Another is how we ensure the survival of a cultural infrastructure and apparatus that is really crucial to the health and future of the city, and also, support the people who have been left without an income. How we ensure the survival of institutions that really depend on continuity. All of these things are tied together. I'm not, far be it from me from offering one solution that will, solve all these problems at once. Some of them they're all tangled. Some of them are really, in the short term, insoluble. But over the course of writing about the arts and the built environment, I've always been interested in the interaction between them. And, in this country, fortunately, we've built up a very extensive and expensive infrastructure of the arts, opera houses, symphony halls, Madison Square Garden, venues that depend on a certain relationship between the performances and the audience, and that are designed to really maximize a certain kind of efficiency within the structures that they create. So the Metropolitan Opera, just to give you an example, is this fantastic machine where you can load up 7-8 performances a week of 3 or 4 different operas. You can strike a set in the afternoon and put on a completely different opera with hundreds of people in the cast at 7:30 that evening. You can get 4,000 people in and 4,000 people out. I mean, it's really a marvel. And each one of those people on the stage is wearing a hand-tailored costume. So the relationship between kind of the industrial apparatus of the building and the craftsmanship of all of the trades that go into that, and the artistry of the performers and the expectations of the audience, all those things work together fabulously. And now it's all still. Now none of it works. It's all just ground to a halt because it is so efficient that it's inflexible. What we need now, both in every aspect of the city, is flexibility. And that really leaves an institution like the Metropolitan Opera or like Broadway theaters really struggling. It does, however, open up some doors for a different constituency in the arts, which is artists and presenters who have been thinking already about altering that relationship between performance and audience, and sometimes to great artistic effect. There's something really intense and moving and very personal when you do that, because you can create, for instance, very intimate artistic experiences in very large venues, whether they're outdoors or in a place like the Park Avenue Armory's Drill Hall, which is this immense 55,000 square foot hangar. but where I've been to events that create this kind of very intimate connection between the artist and the audience member, precisely because there's so much space, so you can manipulate it in all these different ways. It's the equivalent, indoor equivalent of a large, Spanish plaza. And so when you change that, it means that social distancing can become a tool rather than an obstacle. And I think we have a fairly rich, a deep bench of people who have given a lot of thought to this, not because of a pandemic, but because they were already expressing things artistically. And we can go back to them and say, okay, you're up, now is when we need your kind of thinking. Give us some live performance that we can safely attend, that you can safely put on. It's very tricky, it's not an easy thing because it adds a whole other layer of logistical obstacles. But it strikes me that a lot of things that I've seen along those lines are potentially adaptable. And I'll give you just one other example. The High Line, I believe, is still closed. It was for a while because it's too easy for it to become crowded and impassable and make social distancing hard. However, in October of, I think it was 2018, I went to a production of something called the Mile Long Opera, where the audience was all filing in one direction, sort of one by one, waiting online outside to access it. And then as we went up the High Line from south to north, we passed individual performers who were stationed and singing or speaking mostly in low voices directly to audience members who were generally standing, I would say probably no closer than 6 feet apart, or 6 feet from the performers. And that was a really magical experience, an experience of interaction between the arts and the city that I won't quickly forget. The music was by David Lang and Liz Diller of Diller's Scofidio, and Renfro had a lot to do with the concept and the production. Now, could you actually do that? Would it be fun to do that when everybody's wearing masks? I don't know, but for me, it's a clue. It's a sense that here is the kind of thing that you could do and bring back live performance before we're actually ready to go back into pack back into an arena, because who knows when that will be.
Long opera when I read your piece, actually, and I also was reminded of a New York Times piece just recently about performances that are happening at the Stuttgart airport, where one classical musician is playing for one audience member. And they interviewed some of the audience members after the experience, and they said that it was the most intimate and powerful musical experience of their lives in some cases. Now, you can't do that with very many people. Obviously, you can't do 4,000 people in an evening that way, but it was a very interesting example of some of the things that could happen with the right creativity, to your point. People who are good at this and think about this and are already thinking about the public realm as their performance hall. But I wanted to talk a little bit beyond performance too, about some of the many questions that are confronting us about reopening. Obviously, we have no idea whether this storm is going to come back at us, but it's hard to imagine how mass transportation or retail or some kinds of public spaces are going to be affected by the pandemic. I guess I'm curious whether you have words of advice for our city leadership, the influencers as well as the electeds, about how to protect the things that are precious about New York in this very critical moment of response to the pandemic.
Well, I think we need to think about it methodically in terms of the short term, the medium term, and the long term. And in the short term, we're still dealing with an emergency situation. We're not out of it yet. In the medium term, we're going to be dealing with adapting. We're going to be dealing with our behavior rather than the built environment itself. It's clear that until there is a scientific solution or a medical solution, a vaccine or treatments, our behavior, which is our interaction with each other and our interaction with the city, so our interaction with each other in an urban space, is the key to controlling and, ideally even defeating this virus. And then in the long term, the question is, what can we learn from those experiences that we carry forward? And of course, the farther out you get, the hazier it gets. But I think we should think about what we're going through as a series of tests. And that's if you put it that way, it's sobering, because if you think about what the tests have been, right? The first one, as soon as this epidemic revealed itself, was can we contain it? And the answer was no. Then the question was, okay, we can't contain it, so can we blunt its worst effects? And the answer, at least in New York, was no. The good news is that in other cities and other countries, the answer was yes. There are places they've been able to blunt it, just not here. So that was a more local failure. Then, as soon as government started to try to catch up, the question was, okay, well, can we do what we need to do to address the public health issues without bringing financial catastrophe on millions of households? And the answer was no. We failed at that too. So then we're sort of just where the fourth test comes in, which is, can we start to bring the contagion under control? It seems like, yes, there's some reason for optimism there. We're not there yet. The next one is, can we start opening up without triggering a new assault? Let's hope so. That seems like a really, really big question. And there, I would say we are failing potentially, because one of the things that worries me is that we are going ahead trying to reopen really without widespread repeatable testing. And look, don't want to get into the epidemiology or the medical wisdom. This is not my bailiwick. However, one thing is clear, which is that if you're not testing just about everybody, then each of us is kind of taking our chances. Does it feel safe to get on the subway? Okay, well, if you have to, you do. But you're going to make very different individual decisions about that depending on how old you are or what kind of pre-existing conditions you may have, on an assessment of your own medical condition or your age. But not just that, on the medical condition and age of the people you're in contact with, right? I can't get on the subway because I may then come home and infect somebody in my household. So, each of these decisions is complicated. And effectively, what we're doing in the absence of testing is really a kind of mass discrimination against everybody who is in the high-risk categories, namely pretty much everybody over whatever age threshold, 60, 65, you want to say, because those people are really not going to be in a position to embrace whatever public life is starting up again. It's simply going to be too dangerous. Or if you're in contact with some of those people, and who isn't. So, that's in the absence of testing. If before you entered a school building or, any kind of public building, there were sort of a universal regimen of testing, then we wouldn't have that. But since we don't, we basically are continuing the lockdown for some people and not for others. So that's one thing that worries me. And then we have essentially the next tests, which are, can we keep the city from entering a death spiral, where people start to leave, revenues fall, the city becomes less appealing, then people leave, revenues fall, and you have this circle. I don't know the answer to that. That's going to depend on a lot of leadership, and it depends a lot on what we, on making the city continue to be attractive, because there are lots of reasons not to be here, especially in the middle of a pandemic. So we want to make sure that the reasons to be here remain overwhelming enough, powerful enough, that people continue to come and work and stay. And then, the last things, and these last two tests are kind of the things that interest me most right now. One is, can we keep the city from entering death spiral? And the last one is, can we learn something? Can we get the right lessons from this crisis and and change. And what are the lessons that we need to learn? And I think that if we kind of separate out those things, it's useful. So that's sort of like the schema I'm thinking of. I don't know which part of it you want to address, because it's obviously there are a lot of moving parts. But I'd say that one thing that's key to all of those, to both of those shorter and long-term things, is getting around. How do we get around? And that is about public transit, and it's also about management of public space. So when I was talking about performance and the creativity that performers and presenters bring to how we collectively move around a defined space, that kind of thinking can be very useful when we're talking about maximizing the flexibility of the public space we have and how we allocate it, and make sure that whatever we do isn't set in stone, is something that can be changed as we learn lessons, and can even be changed throughout the course of the day depending on what the needs are.
Which is partly what you've just described, is sort of to characterize it a little bit, an underlying fear that people will leave the city, or perhaps use it dystopically, by thinking that the private car, for instance, is the answer to their own protection, if we don't have a better way to manage mass transportation or bike access or any of the other things. So I guess the question really is, do you feel like this is temporal in this situation, or are there really fundamentally structural problems that make people's concerns about density right now legitimate?
You mean is density bad now, but it'll be okay later?
Well, or are there aspects of density that outweigh, to put it in your terms, outweigh the disincentives that it might provide to urban life at the moment, and the fears of current urban life, or that help overcome them as we go forward, I guess?
Well, I think this is where, if you go back to the disasters of the past that I was talking about, sometimes the responses are indirect, and it takes time to figure out what the real threats are. So, I think at the moment it's hard to think past the coronavirus pandemic. And so all of our thoughts 24 hours a day are like, how do we deal with that? And it's difficult to think to a point where that's not our primary anxiety, and where right now it's like getting in an elevator is an anxiety fraught activity, which I do 4 times a day, and every time I do, I have to steel myself, and there's a whole new kind of set of social interactions that have to do with how many people are in there. Is it really one person per elevator? Does that slow down the whole building and create a knot of people in the lobby or on different hallways? So as we reopen offices, obviously just that is going to be one choke point that people are going to have to negotiate, and that is as much a behavioral thing as a structural thing. But I think the real lessons of this are going to be somewhat different, because I think that it crystallizes, it makes unavoidable the recognition of certain things, certain weaknesses that the city has, and they're not a function of density per se. It's not foreordained. These are things that can be managed. To give you one example, it's clear that one really unfortunate intersection of localized density within a building and design and functionality really all came together to create a perfect storm of misery and death in, say, nursing homes, right? We have to rethink how nursing homes work. That's going to be a big challenge for administrators, designers, because the coronavirus is not the first infectious agent to threaten older people clustered together, right? But we're looking at it more closely now. We can measure the damage. It's unavoidable. But the question of whether nursing homes, for instance, are vectors for the spread of infectious disease, I'm sure is not new. So, we probably need to look at that in detail and say, okay, what do we need to fix here? Another that I wrote about recently was indoor air quality. These are technical things, but nobody ever really thinks much about indoor air quality unless you really start to pass out. You kind of assume it's okay, and that buildings are by and large doing their job by keeping you, at somewhere sort of 65 to 70 degrees, within a general comfort range when it's 95 or 25 degrees outside. And that's all we really care about. But this makes it clear that we should be anxious about indoor air because, there's a lot of things we don't know about the virus, but there are soluble problems. These are things we actually know how to do. We just need to be more aware of them. And I would hope one thing that would come out of this is just more attention to the quality of indoor air, not just as in terms of, as a potential vehicle for spreading infectious disease, but also, in terms of the chemicals it carries and the kind of humidity, productivity. Does it make us sick? Does it make us alert? All of these things. How does it use energy? A whole set of things that aren't directly related to the coronavirus. Public transit is another. Like, we all knew that we had problems regionally with public transit in this city, right? There's no mystery to that, and we even knew, how to fix it technically. There are plenty of ideas for that. The political will is what was lacking to come up with the money to do it. So now we have a distinctive set of coronavirus-related problems. But the remedy is a long-term one, which is, the more efficient your public transit system is, the more all of those other issues with the public space, of traffic, of pollution, of congestion, and of, congestion on the platforms and in the cars, the more those things get alleviated. So, I think when I talk about the long-term lessons, it's like, yes, density is great for some things and not great for others. There's no surprise there. The real question is how we manage it. I don't think that long-term there's going to be a real move to de-densify New York. And people who love New York don't want it to de-densify by losing population to the suburbs or to other cities, because that's a form of failure. So the real question is, how do we adapt the density we have? How do we manage it technically to make the city more livable? Those were always desires that the MAS expressed. Those are all things that, are part of the livable city. Nothing new about that. But the question is now whether we can see them, and you don't have to be an activist or an expert to recognize that these are, urgent matters, and that maybe those can galvanize a kind of political will to deal with them. And I would put, issues of spatial equity in that same category. We all knew we had a homelessness problem. We all knew we had a school segregation problem. We all knew that, NYCHA was in terrible shape. All of those things have been crystallized by this epidemic, and they become things that we, have an obligation not to ignore anymore.
To watch Washington, D.C. acting like a bunch of social democrats suddenly, largely in a sort of scattershot kind of way. But I guess if you were to think about public infrastructure projects, particularly in New York here, that would both stimulate the economy, but also begin to get at some of these structural problems that we need to address, what would those be?
Well, again, nothing particularly new. I have been challenging myself and others to come up with a way in which this experience of a pandemic has fundamentally changed the way I and others think about any particular topic. Because what I found is that almost all the discussion about how we use urban space and our approach to cities is simply the argument is almost always, see, this pandemic changes everything, And mostly what it does is show that I was right all along. The thing that I've been saying for 20 years was, now everybody can see is right. And there is an element of that. I certainly feel that about certain things. So I think one of the things we need to do is really be honest, and I'm not sure we're there yet. I know I'm not. To look at our priorities and say, I cared a lot about this 6 months ago. I really thought that this was important to the future of the city. Now I can see that there are other things that are really more important, or I really need to think about it a different way. I think some things are gaining steam in the short term, and it remains to be seen how they play out. Obviously, the idea of pedestrianizing streets is one of those things. The idea of working from home obviously is, I've always done that, and seen the wisdom in that. So I'm glad to see that it's other people have joined me in that. But so in terms of infrastructure, I think, as I said, one of the things that this really crystallizes is the importance of having a smoothly efficient public transit system. And I think that what we're going to have to do, and I think this would be good in many ways for the city as a whole, is to tie infrastructure projects to changes in attitude and behavior. And what I mean by that is I think we need to abolish rush hour. And if we do that, it opens up a whole set of things, right? Rush hour is a terrible thing for cities. It's expensive, it creates congestion, spreads illness, causes people to be late to appointments. It means that it's polluting because lots of people, school buses are stuck in traffic. It also shifts basically all of the travel on public transit in one direction in the morning and in a different direction at night. So it means that New Jersey Transit has to go park most of its trains in Sunnyside Yard all day and then haul them out for the return rush. This is not an efficient way of running a transit system. It also means that it affects how the development of the city goes. One of the arguments, and I really don't want to open up this can of worms, but one of the arguments for Amazon building in Long Island City was that it would reverse that a lot of people would be reverse commuting, so that the 7 train would be balanced, be bringing people from Queens into Manhattan, but it would also be at the same time bringing workers from Manhattan and New Jersey and other parts of the city into Long Island City. So I think that abolishing rush hour, which is a relatively easy thing to do in terms of changing behavior, right? You stagger work times. This was something that the authorities did already in the Spanish flu in 1918. If we did that permanently, it would actually have a dramatic effect on public transit, on pollution, on flexibility of people's lives, probably on education results, because it would mean high schoolers who would prefer to start school at 10:30 or 11 or noon don't have to get up at the crack of dawn to be in their seats at 8 o'clock. And the sort of development pattern of the city. Are we going to be able to sustain a central Manhattan-centric central business district of offices? Is that going to be the future? We don't really know. But if you start to stagger the way people interact with their workplaces, maybe they're going in late in the day, maybe they're only working in their offices 2 or 3 days a week and from home at other times, maybe they're going into the office for specific meetings and otherwise they're somewhere else. That creates a set of desires that people have to distribute office space and integrate it better with residential neighborhoods. So all of that is potentially a very powerful thing that stems from both investment in the infrastructure of public transit and also this behavioral change.
Really critical things that are going on in the world, whether it's Paris's suggestion that we all ought to be living within 15 minutes of our workplaces and the places we shop and so on. I think New York is a more integrated city than that might imply. But in the time that I've grown up in New York, the There were businesses close to where people lived for a long time. Manufacturing jobs or whatever were close at hand. And then they started to centralize or leave the city entirely. And now the city again has begun to have these sort of city centers, which have begun to develop all over, whether it's Jamaica, central Jamaica, or downtown Brooklyn, or Long Island City. And I guess what you're describing is really, from a public policy perspective, really thinking about that in a more deliberate way as it affects mass transportation and other things. It might really change the way we live if our directions to work and to home and to school were, first of all, much closer, and second of all, much more distributed across this very big landmass that is New York City.
I think, in Paris, you're referring to the idea of the 15-minute city, which is a part of the Mayor Anne Hidalgo's platform. As I understand it, that idea is not that we should all be living within 15 minutes of our workplace, but that all of the services and experiences that we rely on are available within 15 minutes. Doesn't mean that we don't commute across the city to our workplace, because if that's where the job is, but that we don't all have to commute to the same part of the city all at the same time. And we don't all have to go to the same, massive bureaucratic center to renew a driver's license or whatever. And so I think that what you're really talking about is decentralization. And, that's something that has been underway in New York in fitful ways, right? Downtown Brooklyn was rezoned. We're talking about 15 years ago, with the idea of creating an office district for just that purpose. Actually, in the end, it just created a high-rise residential district with virtually no new office space. Why? Because the companies that, the real estate market discovered that the market wasn't there, that the companies that, in the abstract you might think would want to be located in downtown Brooklyn actually don't. They want to be in Manhattan. So will this sort of help decentralize the city in ways that are beneficial? I just don't think that we should. I really keep trying to avoid prognostication, and will it happen? I don't know, but there are certain things that we can not just hope, but kind of try to push. None of this is foreordained. There are going to be reasons to do and not to do, everything you might want to get behind. But the more clarity we have, both as we're going on and then ultimately in retrospect, about what this experience meant for us, the more we can focus on the things that really need to get done for the benefit of the city. And one of the things I think is that we became, again, unavoidably aware through this crisis, both how interconnected everybody is in the city, right? How interdependent we are. If somebody I don't even know and have never met can't get to their workplace, 5 miles from where I live, actually that has an effect on me. I don't think I care, but actually now I've discovered, oh, well, because they can't get, there's a whole ripple effect that does have impact on my life. So we've discovered a lot about the interconnectedness. We've also, unfortunately, discovered a lot about the segmentation of the city and how unequal the impact of the virus was on different parts of the city. Now, these are things that I don't think we should be complacent about, but we also shouldn't be simplistic about understanding. Do we really know why that's true? Do we really understand why New York was hit so much harder than almost anywhere else in the world? Do we really understand what the mechanism that the virus takes advantage of? When we talk about density or public transit, Do we understand where those vulnerabilities are? I would say the answer to all of those questions is no. And until we have clearer answers, it's hard to draw conclusions about what we should do. But one thing is clear: the health outcomes related to the coronavirus are simply a repetition of health outcomes that already existed. Disparities in health outcomes and all kinds of other economic and educational outcomes that were already there. You know, we can't really look away from that anymore. And, you know, how we actually tackle those issues, you know, those are not new issues. There have been all kinds of solutions and policies to address them for, you know, 100 years and more. But in our lives at this juncture, you know, we have to be very clear about a vision for the city. And I think that what I hope happens over the next 6 months or a year, at least, you know, speaking, you know, in my mind and hopefully in others, is to just dwell on those things and try to figure out, okay, well, why did that happen? You know, and what does it mean? What are the urban failures that it highlights? And what are the top priorities in terms of figuring out, you know, where we need to go? And that translates into a vision for the city in the future. And, you know, what is our goal? And I would say that overall, on the sort of the macro scale, the goal is largely what it was before, which is to make the city magnetic, to make the city a place that, you know, when I called my book Magnetic City, it was because I had this sense that people are drawn to it, even people who never come here. They have a sense of attraction to it, of ownership, even if they've only ever read about it or seen it as a location for a show or a movie on TV. People all over the world know quite a lot about New York, and that sense of its appeal at all levels of society, whether you're coming or you want to come, you know, as an immigrant with nothing in your pocket and you're just going to find whatever there is, or, you know, you come because you're an aspiring professional, or you come, you know, to raise a family, or because there's a good job, or because you want to start a company. And then, you know, whether you stay because you want to raise your kids there, or because you want to retire here, you know, all of those reasons ultimately come down to the attractiveness of the city. And that's not a simple thing. I don't just mean like, is it clean and pretty? Does it have, you know, expensive coffee? I mean, in a deep way, does it have something for everybody? Is it tolerant? Is it open? Is it feel like a place that is welcoming? Does it feel alive? You know, these are qualities that are kind of abstract, but that have very concrete manifestations, things we need to protect. And that's certainly the arts, for instance, is a big part of that. And so is, you know, restaurants, which is another thing we haven't talked about.
And all of these things are so interconnected, it's really hard to unweave them at the moment. I think it's particularly difficult to imagine solutions that don't affect other sectors, potentially in strong positive ways and potentially in negative ways. I think a number of people have asked questions about the different reactions of people who have the ability to leave the city, and those who have been either made deliberate choices, as you did, to remain, and those who can't. And I guess I'm curious whether you think that the magnetism that you're describing is really critical to making sure that those who can leave stick, and don't leave the city behind for whether it's country homes or other cities with less pandemic impacts. So that's a complicated question. I know I'm asking, but I'm just curious quickly what your thoughts are about that.
Well, again, I think the answer to that is different depending on whether we're talking the short term, the medium term, or the long term. You know, in the short term, I completely understand the desire to not have to deal with the obstacles that being in the city present. I face those every day. So people do what they need to do, and where they feel comfortable, where they can minimize their anxiety. I have no problem with any of that. In the longer term, it's crucially important that people that sense of connection with the city is powerful enough so that, as it did after 9/11, when a lot of people left in the short term, first of all, people start to come back. Even more important is that we make sure to keep the gates open for new arrivals, for people from other parts of the country and from abroad, because it's that churn. I'm not so worried. People have always left the city and written about it and gloried in it and said hasta la vista, fine. It's always been a hard place to, raise kids, and, there are trade-offs. But, it's because it's a dynamic place and it's economically vibrant that it's been attractive to people coming from other places. And, whether they're coming in at the sort of top of the socioeconomic ladder or the bottom. And so I think we need to really that is a resource we need to protect. We need to protect that churn, that population churn, the sense that, that's what keeps, that's what powers New York, is this sort of flow of people in and out. Right now, that has completely stopped, right? Basically, nobody can come in, people can leave, and then it's hard for them to come back. But that's an emergency situation, and I think that will be unblocked. Then we get to the sort of the death spiral part I was talking about before. Can we keep that from picking up steam? And because once it does, that becomes a mechanism that's very hard to reverse. And it's going to take a lot of very clever leadership, for instance, to deal with constricted municipal budgets. Can the in the short term, can the de Blasio administration cut those budgets while still maintaining services enough so that the city does not feel like it's falling apart? You asked about infrastructure projects before. I mean, the federal government obviously has a big role in the future health of the city in many different ways. One of them is, the country's economy can't fully reopen unless New York's economy is really up and running. This is too important a piece. It's too big a slice of the GDP. It's too important a piece of the whole picture. You just can't cut it off. So, I would hope that there is still someone in Washington, or there soon will be, who can recognize that, for instance, mass transit infrastructure in New York is not just a sop to some senator you don't like, but is actually something that is contributes to the economy of the city, to the fluidity of New York, to the health of New York, and therefore to the region and the country as a whole. All these things are connected. The country is connected in the same way that that we've discovered New York is. So, all of the things that we've been agitating for in terms of improving the city's, mobility, renovating Penn Station, and another rail tunnel under the Hudson. These things they were important, and in an emergency when dollars are tight, they actually become more important because the city can start to fall apart faster now.
We'll make that a prayer for the interconnectivity of New York to the rest of the United States and vice versa, and respect for that interconnectivity. Thank you so much for this conversation. It was really fun.
Well, thank you for having me.
For hours and hours, that's clear. So I hope there'll be another opportunity. But thank you to everybody who joined us this evening, and thank you especially to you, Justin, for your time and your continued thoughtful writing about this magnificent city that we all share.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Take care.